Hey guys, welcome back. Today I'm looking at some of the complex connections between Tolkien, popular conceptions of his work, and music. This is a dense topic, and this video is certainly not going to be exhaustive. Instead, my goal is to outline some ways this topic could be approached, and the possible implications thereof. I should also point out now that as much as I appreciate music, I have only a basic awareness of the principles and theories that explain how and why it works. So if you notice any mistakes or missed opportunities, please do drop a comment letting me know. I'd be even more grateful than I usually am for the feedback. Music played important and often unexpected roles in Tolkien's personal life. His family on his father's side had been piano makers in the 1800s. His wife Edith had trained extensively in piano and was at one point being considered as a prospective concert pianist. His memory of watching her sing and dance in a hemlock-filled glade near the village of Roos was the germ of the story of Beren and Luthien, one of the most critical legends in his mythology. Reminiscing to his son, he later wrote, "In those days her hair was raven, her skin clear, her eyes brighter than you have seen them, and she could sing and dance." But despite its importance as a recurrent theme in his life, and his appreciation for it, Tolkien reported having no musical talent himself to speak of. Music gives me great pleasure and sometimes inspiration, but I remain in the position in reverse of one who likes to read or hear poetry, but knows little of its technique or tradition or of linguistic structure. We should maybe take this with a grain of salt, as Tolkien was no stranger to understatement and tactful humility, and we know that he was at least exposed to some foundational concepts of playing music as a boy. In his early years, his mother attempted to interest him in learning the piano, and in one letter, Tolkien also mentions an early effort to teach him to play the fiddle, which left me only with a feeling of awe in the presence of fiddlers. Anyone who can play a stringed instrument seems to me a wizard worthy of deep respect. Despite his lack of proficiency with instruments, he does frame his early interest in languages as being, in a way, his own expression of a musical instinct. Owing to defects of education and opportunity as an orphan, such music as was in me was submerged until I married a musician, or transformed into linguistic terms. This sensitivity to the sonic quality of words guided him in his language-making hobby, but also must have been developed in the scholarly work that might at first seem comparatively dry. As a student of ancient legends in forgotten tongues, Tolkien would have often found himself studying not simply stories, but stories set in verse. Both the epics of classical civilizations, like the Odyssey and the Aeneid, and the Old and Middle English works like Beowulf and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, are narrative poems. What's more, many scholars believe that these ancient works were likely first performed through song or chant. On top of that, before he found success in writing prose fiction, Tolkien had mostly focused on writing and publishing poetry. So even in what looks like a non-musical pursuit, Tolkien had a lot of practice considering things like rhythm, dynamics, and patterns of sound in service of a theme, a decidedly musical approach to literary endeavors. Therefore, it's unsurprising that music is critical in his literary work, both thematically and technically. Tolkien begins his invented history by envisioning the creation of the universe as a great music, the song of the Ainur before Eru, each interpreting, and in one case corrupting, the unifying theme he propounded to them. In the stories set within Arda, music and song are shown to have great magical potential, with characters like Luthien, Finrod, and Tuur making use of it. After working out the first versions of Middle-earth's legends, Tolkien attempted to cast many of them into lays, a medieval poetic form with strong musical ties. In his later novels, he includes a lot of songs and verses. One count finds 10 in The Hobbit and 60 in The Lord of the Rings, a feature that many readers might occasionally find disruptive. However, the inclusion of these songs is not mere indulgence or an attempt at setting a mood. They provide a crucial way for characters to express their feelings and identities, provide necessary backstory, and develop the novel's key symbols and themes. They are also one of the most direct ways that Tolkien can convey the breadth of his world-building, as they reveal the cultural and linguistic distinctness of each character. These songs have made an impact on many readers, some of whom have more explicitly musical ambitions than Tolkien possessed himself. In evaluating Tolkien's influence over music produced by others, I've made a rough distinction between music intended to be a direct response to or interpretation of his work, and music that takes inspiration from it. I've made a further division between the composition of musical settings for Tolkien's lyrics, musical interpretations of the story itself or some element of it, and narrative adaptations that happen to include music, such as films that include a soundtrack. Naturally, these categories are going to overlap, but I think it's useful to consider the relationship between the source text and the musical elements as a starting point. The most direct musical response to The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings was the impulse many readers felt to provide settings for the songs and verses Tolkien had written, with a general aim of expressing what the readers imagined the songs might have sounded like. Writing about the demand for more details about his invented universe, Tolkien reported to Naomi Mitchison that he felt much more comfortable commenting on Middle-earth's economics and geology than he did on matters of architecture, fashion, or music. Later, Tolkien would work with Donald Swann to publish the song cycle The Road Goes Ever On and On, which first appeared as a book of sheet music to accompany 7 of Tolkien's poems. But while Tolkien collaborated personally on this project, he was too busy to engage with the musical part of it as directly as he wanted. This business of the Elvish songs and versions and examples of Elvish script is just precisely what I like doing, but unfortunately it has come at the wrong time, he wrote. Despite these obstacles, we are left with some hints about how Tolkien imagined his songs might sound. There exists a recording of Tolkien reading a portion of The Lord of the Rings aloud, including his rendition of Sam's Song of the Old Stone Troll. According to George Sayer, who made the recording, he sings it to the tune of The Fox and Hens, an English folk tune, appropriate for a Hobbit song as their civilization was meant to reflect the English countryside of Tolkien's youth. So it makes sense that many of the more hobbity songs, including the more rustic elven tunes as recorded by certain hobbits, such as the infamous Tra-la-la-lally, would be well suited by a traditional folk setting. In the early 90s, with guarded approval from the Tolkien estate, the group Broceliande released The Starlit Jewel, which presents 13 of Tolkien's songs performed along these lines. A comparable, though more classically influenced example is the Tolkien Ensemble, a Danish group of composers, musicians, and singers formed in 1995 with the goal of setting and performing all the songs in The Lord of the Rings, resulting in 4 albums: An Evening in Rivendell, A Night in Rivendell, At Dawn in Rivendell, including a guest appearance from Sir Christopher Lee, and Leaving Rivendell. Several commenters, Corey Olsen among them, have pointed out that the snatch of Rohirric lament Aragorn chants in Edoras is an example of the Ubi sunt, or Where Are They Now motif common in medieval English and Latin poems, and it particularly recalls part of the Anglo-Saxon poem The Wanderer, so we might conclude that Rohirric's song might resemble ancient or early medieval English music. Some of Tolkien's other songs, though, invite and even require a bit more freedom in interpreting. In The Hobbit, the party of traveling dwarves apparently carries a small orchestra along with them, including fiddles, flutes, clarinets, a drum, viols as big as themselves, and a harp. After helping themselves to Bilbo's hospitality, as the dwarves play together, suddenly first one and then another began to sing as they played, deep-throated singing of the dwarves in the deep places of their ancient homes. The group Clamavi de Profundis has performed several of Tolkien's songs, and other songs on Tolkienian subjects, in a style that seems to match this description of dwarvish song, with deep voices, complex orchestration, and a generally stirring quality. And then there are the elves, whose music is most often experienced as otherworldly by mortal audiences. As we've seen, many musical instruments are known to exist in Middle-earth, but the most frequently described elven music is singing, with either no or minimal accompaniment. Now, elves often show up in the story when fighting, traveling, or being tricksy, situations where it would admittedly be impractical for them to break out the tubas and timpanis. Most famous elven singers are also known to favor a relatively portable instrument. Dairon has a pipe or flute, and Fingon, Maglor, and Finrod are all seen to use harps, as does Galadriel when bidding the Fellowship farewell. More complicated setups are mentioned, however vaguely, in the more established elven enclaves like in Rivendell's Hall of Fire. But in the context of the narratives we have, elvish singing is what mortals most commonly encounter and attempt to describe in the historical record. We often find words like clear, sad, and sweet being used, as well as the sound of one voice being suddenly lifted above others. Combine that with an assumption that the music of ancient humans must have been heavily influenced by their Eldarin overlords, allies, and you might guess at something like traditional ancient music with historic instrumentation and musical modes, but even older and more alien to our ears, with an emphasis on singing and possibly a preference for call and response and soaring vocal solos. Tolkien was recorded singing a version of Galadriel's Quenya Lament Namarie, which he treats almost like plain chant, and many others reconstructing Elven song have taken their cue from him and drawn on liturgical chants for inspiration. Although it contains only original songs, the album In Elven Lands by The Fellowship provides a good example of the reconstruction approach to Elvish music in particular. The group's official website describes the album as a musicology experiment to find out how the music of J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth may have sounded. An experiment that included the construction of an intentionally corrupted pseudo-Tolkienian text using heterodox Elvish dialects based on Sindarin and Quenya. While this concept might just be an elaborate copyright workaround, it's hard to deny that it is a peculiarly Tolkienian one. Apart from writing music for Tolkien's own lyrics or his descriptions of song, musicians have also interpreted the stories, characters, and images of Middle-earth in works of their own. Some of this takes a purely instrumental form. There are at least 2 classical symphonies, several symphonic poems, chamber music, and countless other compositions, all aiming to interpret some element of Tolkien's work through almost pure musical abstraction. Others have tried their hands at presenting the novel's narrative in different musical modes. Paul Corfield Godfrey started writing operatic adaptations of scenes from the Silmarillion in the 80s, with support and even assistance from Christopher and Priscilla Tolkien. 2023 saw the release of a 10-hour recording of the finished cycle, Epic Scenes from the Silmarillion, after the mythology of J.R.R. Tolkien. Earlier this year, it was announced that the Tolkien estate had granted Godfrey the rights to produce similar operatic treatments of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. There's also a whole series of fan-made rock operas, many of them Russian or Czech in origin, with the best known being Finrod's Song, a retelling of events from the Lay of Leithian that dates to as early as 2001. I admit that when I first heard about these, the concept sounded so gloriously absurd that I didn't believe it was real. But not only does the Finrod rock opera really exist, it's apparently pretty good, has garnered something of a cult following internationally, and is available on YouTube, with subtitles. It's true that pieces like these are primarily striving to convey the narrative, but it seems to me that the focus of something like an opera is on the music, with success or failure depending on how well the piece translates verbal information into musical form. This contrasts with adaptations like plays, films, and TV series that use music to support a primarily visual or verbal medium. In these cases, the goal of the music is to serve the broader work, rather than interpreting or reacting to the source text directly. Howard Shore's work on the 3 Lord of the Rings films of the early 2000s is a prime example of this, and many scholars and commentators, with far keener understanding than I possess, have done an amazing job explaining the score's effectiveness. However, Howard Shore's score tells us more about the goals of Peter Jackson's film than it does about the composer's interpretation of Tolkien, And it succeeds largely because it fits those goals. That is, demonstrating that general audiences could appreciate a serious take on Tolkien's novel that conveyed something of its earnest pathos and meticulous world-building alongside the visual spectacle and stirring adventure of an action blockbuster. A somewhat less revered example, though still beloved by many, would be the music composed for the animated films of the 70s and 80s. The score for the Rankin Bass Hobbit includes a ballad sung by Glenn Yarbrough that serves the same role in the film that narrative asides do in the novel, providing continuity, reassurance, and interpretation for the presumably juvenile audience. The prevalence of verse and song in the text of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings gives composers working on projects like these ones a unique opportunity to exploit something called diegetic music, which is a term I'd heard before but only really bothered examining in the last couple of weeks. In film and theater, diegetic music refers to music produced by an onstage source. For example, Pippin singing the song Edge of Night in the Return of the King film, or that incomparable moment in the animated Hobbit when the goblins of the Misty Mountains break into song as they drag the protagonists down to Goblin Town. The interaction between diegetic song and cinematic score can give a range of effects, but a main pattern I see in most of these examples is that the score directly and often subconsciously communicates to the audience how they are supposed to interpret the action on screen. Diegetic music has more to say about what the characters understand and feel. This complements one of Tolkien's uses of written song. In the novels, symbols and motifs are often introduced either to the reader or the characters in a song. The phrase, "the road goes ever on and on," that opens the many iterations of Bilbo's walking song, at first connotes adventurous excitement. But it's imbued with weariness and futility by the time Frodo comes to what should be his journey's end, only to find he must keep moving after all. The song Bilbo performs in Rivendell about Eärendil describes the significance of the remote but inspiring star. Eventually, its light becomes more poignant and immediate in the depths of Mordor, where Sam realizes with mingled awe and horror that he and Frodo are continuing the very story that Bilbo recounted. You can achieve a similar effect through the repetition of musical patterns and motifs, which appear in both diegetic and non-diegetic contexts in the films. By this logic, you would think that The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are just crying out to be turned into stage musicals. After all, a proverbial principle of musicals is that when a character's emotions become too strong for speech, they sing. And this applies to Tolkien's characters as well. However, the few serious attempts at this have met with mixed responses and little commercial success. And while I am, again, no expert, especially when it comes to musical theater, I think this does make a kind of sense. In a musical, the role songs play in serving the plot is already defined, embedded in the audience's assumptions about what they're about to experience. By contrast, Tolkien's inclusion of so many songs in his novel was unnecessary to the novelistic form, and readers did not necessarily have a framework for interpreting them. The songs themselves contribute to the sense of wonder or strangeness that helps sustain the secondary belief on which Tolkien believed the novel's success depended. It would be uniquely difficult to replicate this effect in a musical, where not only would one expect to find music, as the name does suggest, but its presence is actually necessary to the narrative. So far, we've discussed musical settings of Tolkien's lyrics, abstract musical interpretations of the books, and musical elements in other forms of adaptation. But the most wide-reaching impact of Tolkien's writings was as a source of inspiration, interacting with many other influences on the popular music of the 20th and 21st centuries. I admit I'm drawing a somewhat arbitrary distinction here between, well, to put it bluntly, the kind of music described as serious, classical, or art music, and the kind of music broadly described as popular or commercial. This is not in any way meant to be a comment on the relative skill of the artists, the purity of their intentions, or any so-called fidelity to Tolkien. However, I do think there's a meaningful distinction to be made between the two groups' intended audiences, and their different goals in employing references to Tolkien's work. popular music genres tend to be much more enmeshed with elements of contemporary mainstream culture. So in a lot of cases, it's not just Middle-earth these works aim to represent. They're also drawing on what the stories had come to symbolize in society, beginning as early as the 1960s. My first two examples, both from 1968, should make this pretty obvious. The first is The Ballad of Bilbo Baggins, something the fanwork savvy among us might recognize as a very early example of the crossover crack filk MV. For the blissfully uninitiated, the music video for this song features Leonard Nimoy as Mr. Spock in all his pointy-eared glory, surrounded by cheery, besweatered co-eds, relating the tale of the bravest little hobbit of them all to a horribly catchy tune that, nonetheless, as many have pointed out, does represent the events of the book more faithfully than, for instance, the Peter Jackson Hobbit films. I am kept awake at nights by the unwelcome knowledge that since this piece debuted in 1968, Tolkien was theoretically alive to experience it. Not only that, but in the same year, he is said to have resisted an apparently serious proposal to turn his book into a film starring the Beatles, with Paul McCartney prospectively cast as Frodo and John Lennon as Gollum. Laying aside all of the many cheap shots I could take, I think these two examples demonstrate the pop culture status that The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings achieved after its initially halting rise to fame. As a mid-century novel, The Lord of the Rings was an oddity, with even its champions admitting it was difficult to categorize. It also contained a plethora of implicit critiques of the prevailing culture, so it found favor with other dissidents, some of whom would shape the various countercultural movements for which the 60s are famous. The complex interplay of music, technology, culture, economics, and politics driving these movements would be far better dealt with in a Ken Burns miniseries than in a YouTube video essay, but some relevant observations can still be made. The outbreak of an unseemly Beatlemania in the early 60s had defined the group as the public face of a growing anti-establishment youth culture. But by the late 60s, the Beatles were at the peak of their critical and commercial success. In some sense, they had gone from resisting the dominant culture to defining it. In a similar way, The Lord of the Rings had become popular because of its associations with ideas that had once been considered hopelessly unfashionable at best and dangerously subversive or reactionary at worst. By this point, the novel's cultural baggage, both earned and unearned, threatened to eclipse any appreciation of the work itself, thus reducing Middle-earth to a fad, doomed to eventually become as dated as beehives and bell-bottoms. Against this backdrop, the conscious frivolity of Mr. Spock's music from outer space hits a slightly different note, if you'll pardon the pun, and it presages the cultural role The Lord of the Rings would play in future decades. Leonard Nimoy reported that he was indeed a sincere fan of Tolkien's work at the time, but notably for this music video, he appears in character as Spock, who, as befits the science officer of the Federation starship Enterprise, commanded a fairly robust following of his own. The communities that formed around Star Trek and The Lord of the Rings at this time are now considered some of the earliest examples of modern fandom, where a shared appreciation for a cultural artifact itself becomes the basis for a distinct subculture. And after a curious turn as a mainstream trend, it was in subcultures and fandoms that The Lord of the Rings would carry the most significance in the coming years. You can see echoes of The Ballad of Bilbo Baggins in such classic millennial internet fare as They're Taking the Hobbits to Isengard and Boil 'em, mash 'em, stick 'em in a stew. In what is surely not a coincidence, it's around this time that the concept of popular music, which used to just mean music that was currently popular, gave way to pop music, a genre with distinct conventions and characteristics that set it apart from an ever-growing number of other styles. Most importantly, pop had now parted ways with rock, which was having a reactionary moment of its own. The 70s saw the rise of progressive rock, and when I Googled characteristics of progressive rock, I kept seeing descriptors like distinctly British in origin, too long and complicated, pretentious, a throwback to older musical styles, and dense with literary references. In other words, the reaction to this style of music was very similar to the initial reaction to The Lord of the Rings. Not only that, but references to Tolkien and Tolkienian subjects were so frequent in prog rock that the style earned the nickname Hobbit rock. There's even a band from this era that's simply named Hobbit. In 1970, Swedish musician Bo Hansson released a concept album inspired by The Lord of the Rings, which bears a lot of hallmarks of early progressive rock, such as the use of synthesized keyboard sounds and complex atmospheric compositions. The album was moderately successful, but although it uses the musical idiom of a popular style instead of a traditional one, in its approach to Tolkien, the album has more in common with the Lord of the Rings symphonies than it does with, say, Ramble On. For other bands, Middle-earth's influence was less direct. For instance, several people from my audience pointed me toward the song The Gnome from Pink Floyd's debut album, and even though the song is about a gnome named Grimble Gromble and not a hobbit named Bilbo, the lyrics do seem very indebted to Tolkien's novel. The Canadian trio Rush is renowned, or infamous depending on your perspective, for their long, intricate tracks and lyrics inspired by fantasy and science fiction. Their 1975 album Fly By Night includes a track called Rivendell, describing an enchanted sanctuary by loud waters flow, a reference to the river Bruinen. Their next album featured a 12-minute monster of a track titled The Necromancer. A later song describes a war between different factions of trees in a forest, a subject that inevitably brings Tolkien to mind, and frankly, I do think I should mention that the philosophical sentiments expressed in songs like Closer to the Heart and The Spirit of Radio fit all too neatly with Tolkien's distrust of the sorcerous influence of technology, but at this point I am clearly digressing. Finally, Led Zeppelin is probably the best-known example of how bands continued to use Middle-earth references as countercultural markers while changing the emphasis on certain images and themes to support their evolving artistic aims. The song Misty Mountain Hop, for instance, tells how the singer meets some flower-bedecked people in the park and joins them for recreation in the grass until the authorities arrive to harsh his buzz. The last verse concludes jadedly that folk down there really don't care, and so he's packing his bags for the Misty Mountains, over the hills where the spirits fly. The Battle of Evermore contains references to the Dark Lord and Ringwraiths, and is generally replete with the kinds of lines you might expect to find in a book like The Lord of the Rings, but it doesn't seem to actually connect very deeply with the events of the novel. Ramble On describes a wanderer who seems to be forever saying goodbye, questing endlessly and futilely despite his exhaustion for the queen of all his dreams. It famously includes a line about meeting a fair girl in Mordor before she's stolen away by Gollum and the Evil One, in what would have been a rare case of collaboration between the two had it actually occurred in the books. Real academics have written actual papers on the link between Led Zeppelin's nostalgic pseudo-medievalism and Tolkien's writings, or at least the popular conception of them. This theme had parallels in the literature of the era as well, as the popularity of The Lord of the Rings sparked a boom in Tolkien-esque fantasy. For better and for worse, this solidified many of the tropes of high fantasy that audiences now take for granted, including the generic, vaguely medieval setting that was forever to be associated with Middle-earth, despite the protests of the purists that you really can't describe Middle-earth as a medieval setting in any meaningful way. This trend also contributed to the increasing popularity of Tolkienian and fantastic lyrics in folk music, though the term folk, like pop, had come to denote something very different at the end of the 20th century. Bluegrass music, for instance, is not usually associated with hobbits or elves, even though it has strong historical ties to the kinds of songs that actually inspired Tolkien. Those creatures do make more regular appearances in the kinds of folk-adjacent music that came to be variously described as traditional, Celtic, New Age, or world music. Irish artist Enya's third album included a track titled Lothlorien, but moreover, her ethereal style, and the rising demand for it in the 90s, prompted Peter Jackson and Howard Shore to approach her to contribute to the soundtrack for their films. The film's success, in turn, further deepened the conflation of her style with Tolkien's aesthetic. The aptly named David Arkenstone, a prolific New Age artist, released the album Music Inspired by Middle-earth in 2001, the same year the Fellowship film came out. In 2003, as the film trilogy concluded, the Celtic Renaissance duo Brobdingnagian Bards released Memories of Middle-earth, which mostly consists of original instrumental pieces, but culminates in the psychopathic chronic schizophrenic Gollum Blues, a criminally underrated masterpiece which surely belongs on some kind of cultural heritage list. Comparable artists who have adapted Tolkienian material more recently include Carlion, Uriel, and Caprice. But of course, wistful vocals and pentatonic tin whistles are not the only way that Tolkien's legacy is expressed in today's music. For in the heart of Birmingham, in the fires of 1969, another kind of rock was made. To the casual observer, heavy metal may appear fundamentally at odds with Tolkien's writings. But under the surface, of course, both are more complex than they first appear. As a genre, metal encompasses extremes, even paradoxical ones. It draws from ever more eclectic traditions and crosses over freely into other genres, yet despite this fluidity, its sonic hallmarks are remarkably uniform, a distinctive pattern endlessly iterated with seemingly minor variations, resulting in a genre so diverse they had to make an actual map for it. Its many subtypes are often narrowly and sharply defined and subject to much debate. God help you if you can't distinguish doom metal from black metal or industrial from death thrash. I definitely still can't. This diversity aside, it does seem fair to say that overall, the style is marked by an intensity of expression, and frequently a lyrical and aesthetic emphasis on the most elemental of human experiences. Some might confuse this for a lack of subtlety or skill, but both artists and aficionados tend to value technical ability and precision very highly. This potential for great sophistication, coupled with the genre's embrace of theatricality and emotional excess, and, yes, the persistent popularity of a dark fantasy aesthetic, means metal is often perfectly suited to handle Tolkien's darker themes and more complex narratives. These are present in The Lord of the Rings, but they are downright unavoidable in his First and Second Age material, which was gradually being published throughout the 80s and 90s. As a result, metal may be the genre where references to Middle-earth are most frequent, explicit, and unashamed. After all, it's easy to laugh at the pencil necks soothing themselves with fantasies of being armored, muscle-bound battle bards. It's much harder to laugh at those who appear to be living the dream. It's common for artists to borrow words and names from Middle-earth, typically names of villains or monsters, words in the Black Speech, or regions or fortresses of iniquity. There have been multiple bands called Balrog, Nazgul, and Sauron. Others include Amon Amarth, Samath Naur, Gorgoroth, Burzum, and Morgoth. At times, a particular track or lyrical reference will pay homage to Tolkien's influence. Black Sabbath, for many considered the original heavy metal band, wrote a song called The Wizard inspired by Gandalf. In 2001, Sabaton gave us Shadows, describing the Ringwraith's hunt for the ring, with lyrics reportedly written in 20 minutes. And let's just say that upon reviewing the evidence, I find that report credible. Some bands frequently address Tolkienian themes or subjects, or try to evoke the moods he seemed to favor. The Italian group Windrose has been described as dwarven metal, with songs like To Erebor and the pervasive Diggy Diggy Hole. The related sub-subgenre of elf metal feels like what we would get if a young Maglor had dealt with his daddy issues by forming a band with his Warcraft guild instead of committing multiple genocides. And while that sounds like an insult, I swear I mean it in the most complimentary sense possible. Songs like Nightwish's Elven Path and the band Elven King exemplify this. Finally, at the extreme end of the heavy Mithril spectrum, multiple groups have devoted entire albums to Middle-earth, and for more than a few, an appreciation for Middle-earth seems to be their whole reason for being. Examples include Summoning, whose work is 99% based on the Silmarillion and The Lord of the Rings, the similar case Battle Lore, with their concept album Doombound focusing on the story of Turin, Furienholt with releases like By the Waters of Awakening, a reference to Cuiviénen, and Dwerodelf, whose album The Sons of Feanor has one track for each brother in order of their deaths. Now that is metal. But despite this stiff competition, for most Tolkien fans, there's no question of what constitutes the peak Tolkien metal experience. In 1998, the German group Blind Guardian, whose sound has been described as symphonic power metal, released Nightfall in Middle-earth, a concept album based on the Silmarillion. To reiterate, I am not really qualified to comment on music from the inside, but the album was well received upon release and still garners affectionate reviews from power metal fans, though it should be noted that many reviewers admit to being at least familiar with Middle-earth as well. It's among fans of the Silmarillion, though, that the album is most beloved. Any Reddit thread about Tolkien and music is guaranteed to contain at least one exchange, consisting of the complete lyrics of Time Stands Still. Blood Tears is the track that launched 1,000 fanfics, The Eldar will make you cry into your poisoned wine of fate, Mirror Mirror will change the way you feel about drums and fifes, and my inner angsty teen will never not lose her mind over Thorn. With actual comprehensible lyrics and a significant dose of fluting along the usual shredding guitars, the album is melodic and singable enough to be approachable to the uninitiated, and for many, Nightfall in Middle-earth was their gateway drug to metal. The layered style evokes the titanic scope of Tolkien's work, particularly the unrelenting violence of the Silmarillion, and it does so much more vividly than the more delicate, new agey offerings can manage. But what I think is most important to readers is how the album excels at dramatizing, musically and lyrically, the interior experiences of characters we usually see at a distance, whose motivations and actions are only described in the remote style that Tolkien employs for the events of the distant past. It's one thing to read in the Silmarillion that Fingolfin was bitter and wrathful while crossing the grinding ice. It's quite another to hear Hansi Kursch scream lies over 4 bars of dogged drumming that sounds eerily like the trudging cadence of a snowy death march, before a mournful choir hollowly chimes in. If that description has piqued your interest, you should check out Stephen Gibb's track-by-track breakdown of the album that I will link to below. Believe it or not, we have still only just begun to scratch the surface of music inspired by Middle-earth. And the sheer diversity of musical responses is probably the most telling observation I can end with. As much as I hate to end on a bad pun, from casual pop culture references to experimental musicological reconstruction, from full operatic cycles to Vulcan pop, the impact that Tolkien has had and will continue to have really may be best imagined as an echo. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button so that the syncopated sounds of dozens of clicks will create their own beautiful addition to Tolkienian music. You might also consider subscribing. For B-sides, deep cuts, and liner notes, check out my Patreon at the link below. Thank you to everyone for watching, and special thanks to my patrons, including Rico Mariani, Perhyle the Gardener, Amar, Catherine Berry, Dr. Newton Wen, Steve B., John H. Austin Jr., James A. McCormick, Kevin Gilstad, Marcel Ribeiro, Nick Rialo, Jeremy Buckingham, Dorwin Gray, Zach Burns, Brendan Mooney, E. Rose B., Allison Kreutzberg, Frankie 12 String, Joel Bion, and Jared Carver.